Well, actually, since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, Turkey has played an allied role with the United States. And unfortunately for our own country's interest, we have been supporting here different groups that were fighting against the legitimate government of Assad. And the shooting down of the Russian jet was the last step of a break between Turkey and Russia, because remember that in the last months, there has been a new coalition, a new approachment, let's say, measured and built up by Russia to find a political solution. And there was an approachment between Russia and Turkey. Even Erdogan, after meeting Mr. Putin, President Putin, declared that there might be a solution including Assad. So there was an approachment, and with the shooting down of that plane, this approachment was stopped, and now we find Turkey back into fully into the arms of NATO, following again the old policy towards Syria, which is playing a divisive role in Syria and now also in Iraq.
Yes.
But we have to get right the big picture. We have to understand what is the Western policy for the whole region. It is not about, I mean, let's face the facts. We have an international coalition fighting against ISIS. There is the whole Western countries, there is some Arab countries, there is a long-going bombing against ISIS. But this entity still exists. How can that be? So we have to understand fully that such an entity like ISIS cannot survive such an attack if there is not indirect support for it. Well, the 2003 occupation of Iraq was rejected by Turkey, by the Turkish parliament, and by the Turkish military, to begin with that. Second, if you put Turkey as the problem, you won't find any solution in the Middle East, because Turkey here is also the same victim, not to the same degree, but as a victim of imperialist policies which aim at the destruction of the national unity of each of these countries, Iraq, Syria, and in the future, Turkey. The Turkish government has played a very bad role in that. Admittedly, clearly, they have been misguided and are still pursuing wrong policies. Concerning their trade with ISIS, I don't have any proof on that, but there is open proof for their support, for example, for the Free Syrian Army, or for some groups like al-Nusra, or the so-called Army of Conquest, which is operating exactly where the Russian jet was shot down. So,
and do you describe these groups as terrorist groups?
Yes.
Okay.
These are terrorist
they're
groups.
not moderates.
Absolutely.
They're not moderates,
right? The definition is, my definition here is very clear.
Thank you.
Every group that fights on armed ground against the Syrian government and against the Syrian national unity is a terrorist group. And here I would disagree with, I think it was Brian who spoke at last. We would disagree with the YPG, because the YPG is a US-supported group, and we don't consider them as maintaining or supporting the Syrian national unity. It's the opposite way around. When you look at the American attacks against ISIS, then you see that they are all directed to protect what we call here the so-called Kurdish or American corridor. So the fight against ISIS from the US position is nothing else than but the fight for a Kurdish entity there. And it is the same thing that happened in 2003 by the occupation of Iraq. Remember, the first thing that the Americans did was a no-fly zone in the north of Iraq. So maintaining our country's unity is the first and utmost aim here. Well, concerning the downing of the jet, who benefited from that? That's the answer to who shot it down. Right now, behind of me, you can't see it because it's dark here in Istanbul already. There is new NATO ships being presented, being tied at the center of Istanbul. It's a Canadian ship, and it's a Portuguese and Spanish ships. And we have new deployment of NATO troops into US bases, US-controlled bases in Turkey. So the downing of the jet was to the benefit of the NATO, first, to get it right. Second, the thing that the neocons or the imperialist policy, whatever you call it, the thing that they fear most is a Turkish-Russian approachment. So, and this is what's going to solve the problem. Therefore, with all due criticism against Erdogan, we are an oppositional party. We have been in jail because of our criticism, and I'm not at all afraid to criticize Erdogan in no communication media. I have been to Syria to visit the Syrian government some months ago, several times, so no afraidness here. But when we need to solve the crisis here in the Middle East, that is, when we really need to stop the terrorism and not using it as the US does, then we need a Turkish-Russian alliance. That is clear as the sun gonna rise up tomorrow. And therefore, I don't think that the conflict, the deepening of the conflict between Turkey and Russia is to the well of the Middle East region. And I don't agree with one of the participants, I think it was Jonathan, who said that the Turkish-Russian crisis endangers the Vienna process. Well, the Vienna process seems to be nothing else than putting in the progress the division of Syria.